What is up, Endurance? So I have literally had about, I would say, nearly close to 100 messages on Instagram asking me to make comment on Lionel Sanders and his recent coming out with his potential or pre type 2 diabetes and his recent blog post, which is this one on breaking the cycle of bad eating and poor sleep, where he talks about his latest findings with some of his blood glucose results, and people have asked me to make comment. And I honestly wasn't going to do one, and I thought, well, I think most people have made comments, and I guess now I'm a little bit late to the party, but I did want to have some thoughts, and I did go through a few things. And the first thing I would say is that, is this a surprise to me? Of course, it's not a surprise to me. I mean, I think we know that at Endure IQ, for example, our motto is performance, health, and enjoyment, with this idea that you can't just train and not take any accountability for your diet or the way you're periodizing your training and expect good outcomes just because you're an athlete. And there was the paper that was written in 2016 by my good friend Paul Lawson, the prof, who you may all know, and Phil Matheson, was called, Athletes Fit but Unhealthy. And we kind of knew this for a long time that it is possible that given the right situation, even if you're training 24, 25, 30 hours a week, you could end up being pretty unhealthy as an athlete. And of course, that's not the result that we want. Of course, it's not. We do athletic pursuits and we take on these things because we are trying to be healthier. And if you go back and you watch the YouTube clip with Lionel, and I think Lionel's awesome. I'm a massive fan of his, and I love the way he wears his heart on his sleeve. And I think he provides a lot of insight to the triathlon community with his YouTube clips, and everyone loves them. And what it turned out was his HbA1c turned out to be 5.9, which is in the pre-diabetic range. There is some problems with that, of course, is that there is a bit of error in the HbA1c measurements, but he did back it up and he wore CGM, continuous blood glucose monitor. I don't know what type it was, but he did wear it for, I think it was more than 24 hours, and it came out as 123 milligrams per deciliter, which is, it kind of confirms it's almost exactly the HbA1c number. So it confirms that this is the case, and the results are the results. Um, but, I think Lionel kind of has been in this idea that, I have to eat a ton of carbs. This is what he says in there. He says, I have to eat a ton of carbs because I burn a ton of carbs. It's the way of the Western world. He says he's lazy when it comes to eating. He eats not very nutritionally dense food. And I think this is the way most athletes eat. And especially if you're very, very carbohydrate dependent, carbohydrate sources are naturally not very nutrient dense. So proteins and fats generally have more nutrients in them. So, that's typically what it's hardly surprising. But I guess the question is, and this is the question that was asked to me a lot on Instagram, and people came to me wanting me to make a bit of a clip on it, is this common in athletes, and is it something that we need to be concerned about? And unfortunately, I would say that it is becoming increasingly common, of course. And the reason it's becoming increasingly common is that we're just seeing it in more and more data. And this man, Andrew Kutnick, who I actually interviewed on the Pillar Performance podcast not long ago, um, he's been a massive advocate of this and suggesting that athletes could be many pre-diabetic athletes could be out there. And this is just one example from the paper, a paper that was published in Frontiers. It was called Low and High Carbohydrate Isocaloric Diets on Performance, Fat Oxidation, Glucose, and Cardiometabolic Health in Aged Males. So, it showed that there's about 30% of athletes who went on a high carb diet became pre-diabetic, and they had a 31-day glucose in average of between 111 and 150 milligrams per deciliter. So, in 30% of these people, it was in this one study, it was apparent. But what Andrew did a great job of recently is is that he also on X, on what was formerly known as Twitter, he went and he looked at some other studies. And some of these other studies, he looked at many of them from Prince in 2021, 2002, in many competitive endurance athletes. And you can just see from the figure that there's a lot of athletes who are within these studies who are not following a high carbohydrate diet, when doing continuous blood glucose monitoring, there's a hell of a lot of them who are in the pre-diabetic range. And you can argue that, oh, this is part and parcel of being an athlete. It's because of the training that they do. It doesn't really matter. I mean, you regardless of whether you want it, whether that is the cause, it shouldn't have to be, and it still is an unhealthy way to live. And you can, I was listening to I think it was a Durian rider's take on it and saying, "Oh, this is normal." It's definitely not normal. It's not normal if you can control things with the right intensity of training and the correct diet. So why are we seeing these big increases? I think going back to that paper that I talked about, that Fit but Unhealthy by Phil Maffetone and the Prof, that was done 9 years ago, and they were talking about it then. And they brought up this great diagram that was of the talking about the HPA axis and the sympathetic response and how high glycemic, highly processed foods increases inflammation, it increases blood glucose. And the inappropriate volume of high intensity training, it causes inflammation. And of course, what we know is that the glucose is also driven up by inflammation. So typically, if you see high levels of blood glucose, you're seeing high levels of inflammation as well. Typically, with heart rate variability values, you get lower HRV as well. So it's the whole cascade of this sympathetic response and a metabolic substrate an imbalance. And what happens with this is that you have a reduced fat oxidation and an increased reliance on carbohydrates, which only exacerbates the problem. But of course, we also know that, and I think I've talked about this on many occasions, but when I first started doing triathlon, which is a long time ago, I've been doing it actually been doing it for 30 years. We talked about 60 grams of carbohydrates per hour. It went up to 90, and then it went up to 120, and now it's going up to 180 grams per hour. And it's just not there's not very, very little evidence to suggest that this is of beneficial. And this paper here, or this diagram that was from Smith et al., you can see here that from 20 to about 100 grams, and you look at the performance, so better, worse performance, or better performance, after between 40 and 80 grams, there's not much difference in performance. And I guess you can argue all you like, but the general response is, but that's not what the best athletes in the world are doing. What about Pogacar? What about the Tour de France cyclists? If we are comparing ourselves as age group triathletes or aging athletes to the very, very best in the world, literally the 99.99% of the athletic population, we're in the wrong place. And what we have to do is we have to start with the studies and then adapt the nutrition for what we can take. And of course, there are some athletes who might go better on a high carbohydrate diet, but it's not the starting point. The starting point should be lower carbohydrate diets and or lower intakes, not lower carbohydrate diets, because that's where the evidence lies, and it's obviously of better health benefit as we're seeing now. But the thing is that we're seeing more and more in the mainly pushed by industry is we're seeing this idea that gut training is the way forward. So we not only are we consuming more carbs during competition, we're also consuming more carbs during training because we're trying to train our gut. And I've written a whole heap of stuff on this in terms of should we train the gut? Are more carbs better? And you can have a read, enduriq.com, have a read of some of the blogs. Every single thing is referenced in there. There's nothing in there that's made up. It's all referenced, so you can go back and have a bit more of a read of that. But it's the industry who is pushing for high carbohydrates and and gut training, because if you're not training your gut during racing or during training, sorry, then what are we doing? I mean, you're not going to be selling much product, are you? Because you're not, especially in Ironman, you're racing 2 to 3 times a year. So we've really got to train the gut, right? Um, but diet does have a massive impact, and the take home that I would say would be that thinking we always aim for more nutrient dense food. I think prioritizing as athletes, if we prioritize protein more than anything. My PhD student Jeff Rothschild, we did a study that showed that protein seems to be the biggest macronutrient that is having the biggest impact on recovery more than anything, more than carbs. Carbs didn't really seem to have that much of an impact compared to protein. So it looks like, am I sitting here and saying you have to be on a low carb diet? Definitely not. I'm not saying that. And I think now with the work of Andrew Kutnick and Prince, I don't think it really matters. People can perform well on a high carb diet, they can perform on a low carb diet. But as we age, we probably want to be changing our diets in accordance to our metabolism. And our metabolism when we're in our 20s is definitely not the same as our metabolism when we're in our 40s. So we probably might be able to start with a quite high carbohydrate based diet. And as we move on, as we get older, we're probably going to have to look to periodize the carbs that little bit more. And what I would suggest is that if you're interested in carbohydrate periodization in your nutrition, go and take a read of the blog by this man, Dr. Marco Altini, who's a good friend of mine. We are high variability lovers. We're writing a book together at the moment. But he underwent a really great carbohydrate periodization diet. And you can see, this is just an example of how he periodized it. You can see that on the higher energy expenditure days, he was taking a bit more carb. On the lower energy expenditure days, he was reducing his carb. So the gray bars over here represent the gray. And he did a very good periodized carbohydrate approach. And I'm not going to go into the full details of what that looked like, but you can see this is kind of how he did this flow chart of when he would decide to periodize his carb based on the training he did. And to me, this is one of the best carbohydrate periodizations I've ever seen someone do very successfully. Go and take a read of the blog. I'll put some links under here in the YouTube, and you can have a read of how he did it. But it's a really, really great example of how you can get the best of both worlds. You can have, you can really minimize any blood glucose excursions. You can get good adaptation of fat oxidation, and you can hit all your high intensity sessions. And I think, this is something that I've been talking about for a very long time. Right fuel, right time, and this is definitely the way forward. But what is important is that what I said before is that if you are going to be, as we get older, our glucose metabolism gets worse. And you can see this chart here from this figure that shows that, from 10 years old to like in 20 years old, nothing really changes. In 10, 20 to 30, we're pretty good with our glucose metabolism. But as we get to 40, as we get to 50, it does get worse. And that's why, when we talk about periodized nutrition and changing our diet, I think we need to have different considerations as we get older. So what we're promoting, the 20-year-olds to do and what they're doing should not be what we're doing or what age group triathletes are doing to emulate them or copy them, because we're just going to be in a slippery slope. And you'll probably find, Lionel, for example, in his case, he may have been absolutely fine in his early days as an athlete when he was a bit younger, but it's probably just caught up with him as he's got into his late 30s, which you can see from the figure. It's obvious. Another thing I did want to touch on was like high intensity training. So when you're looking at watch that YouTube clip, um, Lionel, he does talk a lot about his diet, but of course, high intensity training and high intensity work makes a big difference to where your blood glucose responds. And this is just an example here of Pelayo. Pelayo's a friend of mine. He's high rocks athlete. He sent me this the other day, and I just said, "Can I use it?" Because it just shows how blood glucose really ramps up when you do high intensity exercise. Good thing about Pelayo is that he's very healthy. He has a good response to his blood glucose, so he's obviously not that insulin resistant, and he removes it very, very quickly out of his blood. But you imagine someone now who's doing a lot of high intensity exercise who is insulin resistant, that's going to stay elevated for a very, very long time. So we have to consider what we're doing in terms of how we're going to be periodizing the high intensity training. And maybe if we are someone who is a bit pre-diabetic, we might have to consider how much high intensity training we're actually doing. We may have to do a little bit less. And I do remember that one of the things that shocked me when I watched back a video from Lionel after Kona, which is this video here, on his debrief, he said that he didn't do one of the reasons he thought he didn't do well was because he didn't do any zone two, or he did very little zone two. And of course, zone two is one of the best ways to dispose of glucose because it's mainly fat burning and you're obviously still burning some glucose at the same time. But it's really good to monitor your HRV, and also look at your daily blood glucose because you can really get on top of these things. Um, and last of all, this isn't me saying it. There is some great research that has shown that, like cell metabolism, for example, did this paper. Excessive training causes mitochondrial functional impairment and decreased glucose tolerance in healthy volunteers. So it's been shown that if you do too much high intensity training, you do it too frequently, then it is going to have a massive impact on your ability to dispose of glucose, which is why at Endure IQ, we're going for that healthy athlete. We're always talking about training periodization, and we're always looking at how we're not backing up too many high intensity sessions back to back, and we're giving ourselves some time in between. So, this is the healthy athlete. How can we actually promote healthy athletes and maintain performance? And I think it is really quite simple. It's really just down to the type of eating we do. I think the right fuel, right time approach is one that most people can get their head around. I think some people may benefit from a low carbohydrate diet in some situations, but it's quite hard for a lot of athletes to get their head around. And I fully appreciate that, of course. And then the type of training you do. Make sure that you have that nice distribution of low intensity training and not too much high intensity training. And as always, as my PhD supervisors taught me, Martin Bichette and the prof, they said to me, context before content. So as we age, we probably will have to change the way that we periodize our nutrition, the amount of carbs we take, and also we will have to consider the amount of high intensity training we're doing on a weekly basis. So hope you enjoyed that. Hope it was what some of you were looking for. And if you listened all the way through, good job. Ciao, ciao.